After our presentation on TWIM was published, the video began to take off and circulate widely. Many people saw it. It quickly began to be circulated among the Suttavadins themselves, and David Johnson and Delson Armstrong, two of the subjects of the presentation, apparently saw it. I discovered this when I received an email from David Johnson containing a message that he claimed was from Delson Armstrong. This is interesting because for 2 years now, I have repeatedly attempted to initiate an honest and open discourse with these men and others in the Suttavada organization. David, in particular, has, right now, in his inbox, several messages from me to which he has never responded. And yet suddenly, when the presentation is published, he decides to reach out. Unfortunately, although they did reach out, their message didn't have much of substance to say. They weren't able to articulate even a single thing that they found to be inaccurate in the presentation. Nor did they offer any kind of explanation or genuine apology for what they had done. In my responses, I made the following invitations. To David Johnson, I offered to give him an interview where he could discuss this matter with me on the record. He could offer his side of the story and attempt to refute any statement that he disagreed with in the presentation. However, he would have to answer any questions that I might ask about the particulars of the TWIM practice and organization. To Delson, I made this further invitation, that I would provide him shelter and food so that we could discuss this matter personally, one-on-one, and come to a mutual understanding. David's response was that he would think about it. In my experience with him in the past, this means that he has no intention of following through. David reported that Delson responded by saying that he didn't know what to say. It's been several weeks since I made these offers. In the meantime, David has appeared on another episode of the Guru Viking podcast, and Delson has made numerous YouTube appearances. It's obvious that these men are not camera shy. So why do they refuse to speak to me? Well, in the case of David, perhaps he simply doesn't feel like he's competent to speak on these matters. And in the books that he's written, he was coached by Bhante Vimalaramsi on what exactly to write down, and served basically a clerical role in that. His appearances on Guru Viking are self-promotional appearances. He isn't having to face questions for which he doesn't have an answer already prepared. So it could be as simple as that. He's unsure of himself. But why would Delson be afraid to speak to me? Delson claims to be an arahant, a perfected one. The arahants that I'm aware of never backed down from an opportunity to clarify the Dhamma. But I think there's an even simpler explanation. Take the example of the hit-and-run driver. They might be driving down a road carelessly, not mindful of the road ahead, and hit someone with their vehicle. Knowing that they've hit someone, but unable to face the reality of that, they don't look back. They don't slow down. They don't stop. They don't try to help that person. They don't call 911. They just keep driving, trying to distance themselves from the scene of the incident. They think that by distancing themselves physically from the incident, they will thereby escape the consequences. The more time that elapses between the incident and the moment they're caught gives them a sense of security. It gives them more leeway in whatever lie they might tell. Perhaps a good Samaritan has seen the impact and chased down that hit-and-run driver, and they're honking and they're yelling out their window, "Stop, you hit someone, stop." But they pretend not to hear that and keep driving. They don't look back. They can't face the reality. They need to maintain this fantasy version of events. If they're forced to stop, they'll immediately start lying and saying they didn't realize they hit anything, or they thought it was a tire on the road. If it were up to them and no one tried to stop them, they would just keep driving and go about their lives, never thinking back on that person that they'd left to die. If the police arrive, they'll tell the same lies to the policeman. All they want is to separate themselves from the situation. They'll say, "It wasn't me. I've got somewhere to be. Let me go." All of these excuses. oriented around getting away from the scene, not facing the reality of the situation. You see, it's not only that they're trying to deceive other people, the Good Samaritan or the policeman, they're also trying to deceive themselves. If they can just stare straight ahead and not look back at the scene of the crime, not look at the victim most of all, then they can maintain this alternate version of reality wherein they had done nothing wrong. But even the law of the land recognizes that running from the scene of a crime is a crime in and of itself. It's an aggravating circumstance. It's an egregious crime. But you can't run away from your bad karma in this way. You can try, and perhaps in the short term you'll think you've succeeded, but eventually the consequences will catch up to you. This is the teaching of karma, of action and the result of action. Even if this hit-and-run driver is arrested by the police, prosecuted in court, and serves time in prison, that doesn't necessarily mean that that bad karma has been exhausted. They may well find themselves reborn in the animal womb, the realm of the hungry ghosts, or hell. So when we see David Johnson and Delson Armstrong continuing on their path, refusing to look back, refusing to face up to the consequences of their actions, what does that look like to you? Does it look like the behavior of an enlightened person? Or does it look like the behavior of a common, run-of-the-mill, hit-and-run driver? Heartless, selfish, uncompassionate. Today, there are people just like those hit-and-run victims, lying, bleeding, injured on the side of the road. People who trusted David and Delson, had faith in David and Delson, followed their instructions to the letter, and got hurt doing so. And yet David, Delson, and the others in their organization show no compassion. What is compassion? Compassion is opposed to harmfulness. When Pavel and Oleg showed David, Delson, and others their document on Suttavada, which described many of the same problems that were covered in our presentation, how did David and Delson respond? They responded just like the hit-and-run driver. They kept going in the same direction they had been, without stopping, without looking back, without considering their actions and the consequences of their actions. Even though it's been several weeks since I made this invitation, and I've received no response, and David has ignored my follow-up messages to him, in spite of all of that, my invitation still stands. I'm open to communication. I would like to discuss these matters. I'd like to get at the truth, and I'd like to share that truth with all of you. But David and Delson don't seem to want that. Why is that? Well, just like the hit-and-run driver, they would happily drive off into the distance themselves as much as possible from the consequences of their actions. It's only when a policeman or a Good Samaritan comes up behind them and exerts pressure for them to stop that they do. So it's up to us, it's up to the community to exert the necessary pressure. I think you'd be surprised how few people it would really take to exert that kind of pressure. Going a deeper level into what motivates the hit-and-run driver, there's this component of surprise and disbelief that it could be so easy to kill another being. The hit-and-run driver is just driving down the road, preoccupied with something else, thinking about what they're going to do when they get to their destination. But they're heedless and careless, and through that heedlessness, they end someone else's life. And they simply can't believe that it could be that easy. But the truth is, it is that easy. Think about firing a gun, or simply pushing someone in an argument. They could fall down, hit their head, and die instantly. Even by simply giving someone bad advice, telling them that something is safe when in fact it isn't. Through the mere act of influence, someone can come to grave harm. Here on YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, we've all heard the stories. People influenced into taking pictures in dangerous locations and falling to their deaths. Young children influenced into asphyxiating themselves for the sake of some TikTok trend. On YouTube, there were numerous videos describing something called fractal wood burning, which has resulted in hundreds of people being electrocuted, most of them dying instantly. Was it very difficult for the people who made these videos to make them? No, it was quite easy, and in many cases it was profitable to do so. Think about all the difficulty that goes into bringing up a life in the world. A mother and father to give them life and nourish them, take care of them all throughout their childhood, educate them. That person has to go to work, earn a living, spend years learning skills, developing themselves. And it can all be taken away just like that, in an instant of carelessness and inattention. And 40 years of hard work goes down the drain just like that. All because someone wanted to get someplace in a hurry and didn't care what happened to anyone else. And of course, such a person is very unlikely to be aware of their defilements. If you ask them, are you a greedy person? Are you a hateful person? Are you a deluded person? They would say no, of course not. They might even tell you that they're an empath and they're very compassionate, etc. This is a passage from the Tranquil Sutta, which describes a way to know whether someone is enlightened or not. There is the case, Bharadwaja, where a monk lives in dependence on a certain village or town. Then a householder or a householder's son, having gone to him, observes him with regard to these three qualities: qualities based on greed, qualities based on aversion, qualities based on delusion. Are there, in this venerable one, any such qualities based on greed that, with his mind overcome by these qualities, he might say, I know, while not knowing, or say, I see, while not seeing, or that he might urge another to act in a way that was for his or her long-term harm and pain? As he observes him, he comes to know there are, in this venerable, no such qualities based on greed. His bodily behavior and verbal behavior are those of one not greedy, and the Dhamma he teaches is deep, hard to see, hard to realize, tranquil, refined, beyond the scope of conjecture, subtle, to be experienced by the wise. This Dhamma can't easily be taught by a person who is greedy. And then it goes on to describe the other two qualities. It's in reference to this that I want to show you this post by Doug Kraft on the TWIM forum. Doug is one of the Suttavadins. He's a TWIM practitioner, although he's sort of spun it off into his own practice that he calls easing awake. He's written a couple of books on this. In one of them, Befriending the Mind, he speaks in praise of Carlos Castaneda, who was also an influence of Bhante Vimalaramsi's. But the thing to know here is that Doug considers himself a spiritual leader, a kind of guru, and the head of his own ministry. He also brings to bear in his twist on the TWIM teaching his background as a Christian minister and his background as a student of psychology. So he makes this post on October 11th about combining meditation and psychedelics such as psilocybin and LSD. And the first reply is from Andrew here, who points out quite rightly that one of the 5 precepts is to abstain from any intoxicants. There is no place for the combination of meditation and psychedelics. Andrew is correct here, but of course the idea of taking a shortcut through the use of drugs is highly appealing to many people. It's just so much easier than actually putting in the work. And people can have notable, impressive experiences from these drugs, which they mistake for some kind of spiritual attainment. And then Doug chimes back in, defending his position. He says here that in regard to the 5th precept against taking intoxicants, it's his impression that the Buddha was concerned about heedlessness. That is, the possibility that intoxicants can blunt our judgment and thinking. And then he makes the first revelation here when he says, Bhante V, that's Bhante Vimalaramsi, drank coffee and smoked cigars. I assume he didn't think they made him heedless. Well, I agree. It's doubtful that Bhante Vimalaramsi believed that drinking coffee and smoking cigars made him heedless. That doesn't mean it didn't. Caffeine is a stimulant, and all stimulants share this property of helping psych people up to do things that they wouldn't do otherwise. And, of course, this is somewhat dose-dependent. The problem is that these are addictive substances, and they lead to craving in the future. And also they give rise to the hindrances of sloth and torpor and restlessness and anxiety. It's impossible to enter the first jhana without abandoning these hindrances. So if your aim is to do jhana practice, or even simply to not be bothered by these particular hindrances, then drinking coffee or smoking cigarettes or cigars is counterproductive to that aim. But getting back to psychedelics, psychedelics clearly lead to heedlessness. When a person takes a psychedelic substance and begins to hallucinate, this is very similar to a psychotic break. So for example, a person on psychedelics might think that they can fly and jump off of a roof and be killed. They might strip off their clothes and run into traffic, or they might even simply say something that they regret later. Something, for example, that damages a relationship or provokes a fight. This is a sutta called the Vipaka, or Results Sutta. And it says here that the drinking of fermented and distilled liquors, when indulged in, developed, and pursued, is something that leads to hell, leads to rebirth as a common animal, leads to the realm of the hungry ghosts. The slightest of all the results coming from drinking of fermented and distilled liquors is that when one becomes a human being, it leads to mental derangement. Well, psychedelics clearly also lead to mental derangement. As anyone who has been around someone on LSD or psilocybin is well aware, and in some cases this mental derangement, this state of psychosis, can last for the rest of that person's life. Then here Doug talks about his father being alcoholic, so he avoided alcohol for most of his life. But he says, still, on some social occasions, to refuse alcohol could have been confused with me thinking that I was better than others. So I might take the champagne glass and join in the wedding toast. Well, how's that for an excuse? He doesn't want people to think he thinks he's better than them. Again, this guy is presenting himself as a spiritual leader, and he's drinking alcohol because he doesn't want people to think he thinks he's better than them. He's violating this precept because he's afraid that people will judge him for not drinking. The only way that good people, intelligent people, would judge him for not drinking is by judging him positively. So here he is, worried about what fools would think. Not what wise people would think, not what the noble ones would think about what he does. And then he gives some argument weakening the conviction of his precepts. And then, as if this all isn't bad enough, it escalates quite a bit here.
When a car ran over my cat, leaving it thrashing in the street with a broken back, the first precept flickered through my mind, but only for a half a second. I got a bucket of water and drowned her as quickly as I could. I grieved the death of my dear kitty friend. But if I had refused to break the first precept and refrained from killing her and let her suffer for another 15 or 20 minutes until she bled to death, I think I would have been immoral. It was a case where relieving suffering was more important to me than non-killing.
So we see that it only took half a second for Doug to decide to violate this precept. Let's look at the consequences of that. Monks, The taking of life, when indulged in, developed, and pursued, is something that leads to hell, leads to rebirth as a common animal, leads to the realm of the hungry ghosts. The slightest of all the results coming from the taking of life is that, when one becomes a human being, it leads to a short lifespan. Bear in mind that encouraging others to break the precepts is just like breaking them yourself. So it only took him half a second to come to this decision. He says he got a bucket of water and drowned her as quickly as he could. He grieved the death of his kitty friend. And so here we get to the crux of it. Whose suffering was he relieving here? He couldn't stand to watch this cat for another 15 or 20 minutes. Was he trying to relieve the cat's suffering or his suffering? Think about it. This cat loved this man, had faith in this man. This was someone who provided it shelter, who fed it. How do you think that cat felt when he picked it up and held its head under the water? I'm sure you're aware how much cats dislike going into water. Now this is about Doug relieving his suffering. He couldn't stand to watch. And he thinks that was more important than not killing. And then he goes on to make an argument for moral relativism, that the precepts are just tools, just guidelines, not really as important as the Blessed One said they were. And then, this is typical, all of the Suttavadins do this. He signs with metta. Metta is goodwill. Now, this is a guy who's trying to convince people to do drugs, trying to convince people that it's okay to consume alcohol, trying to convince people that it's okay to kill, and telling you that he killed and feels good about it, feels satisfied with himself about that, that this is a correct interpretation of the Dhamma. And he signs his letter with goodwill. Now, I haven't seen any evidence of goodwill here, and yet he signs it this way. This is the insincerity of the Suttavadins. They all sign their letters this way. They could say the most horrible, terrible, despicable thing and sign it with metta. That just goes to show you their depth of understanding here. And of course, they're oblivious to the contradiction here. It's a cognitive dissonance thing. They think this is goodwill. Doug has just spent all of this effort rationalizing his understanding of how we can just bend these rules and it doesn't really matter anyway in the absolute realm, so just go ahead and do whatever you feel like. But you'll never find in the suttas a noble person speaking like this. Why is that? So David Johnson does participate in this thread, but rather than criticizing Doug's statements here, he tells this bizarre story about having a guy on forgiveness meditation, and then he felt a column of energy or light going straight out of his head, and he saw all the emotional blocks just swirling around this column. This has nothing to do with the Brahma Vihara practice. Anyway, it's just an out-of-context statement that shows either an obliviousness or a lack of reading comprehension or just a lack of interest in actually teaching the Dhamma. Now, we've talked a lot about what the Suttavadins think compassion is and think goodwill is. But what did the Blessed One think it was? This is a story from the Vinaya, which is the monastic code. And let's just go over it real quick. Now at that time, a certain monk was sick with dysentery. He lay fouled in his own urine and excrement. Then the Blessed One, on an inspection tour of the lodgings with Venerable Ananda as his attendant, went to that monk's dwelling, and, on arrival, saw the monk lying fouled in his own urine and excrement. On seeing him, he went to the monk and said, "What is your sickness, monk?" "I have dysentery, O Blessed One." "But do you have an attendant?" "No, O Blessed One." "Then why don't the monks attend to you?" "I don't do anything for the monks, Lord, which is why they don't attend to me." Then the Blessed One addressed Venerable Ananda. "Go fetch some water, Ananda. We will wash this monk." "As you say, Lord," Venerable Ananda replied, and he fetched some water. The Blessed One sprinkled water on the monk, and Venerable Ananda washed him off. Then, with the Blessed One taking the monk by the head, and Venerable Ananda taking him by the feet, they lifted him up and placed him on a bed. Then the Blessed One, from this cause, because of this event, had the monks assembled, and asked them, "Is there a sick monk in that dwelling over there?" "Yes, O Blessed One, there is." "And what is his sickness?" "He has dysentery, O Blessed One." "But does he have an attendant?" "No, O Blessed One." "Then why don't the monks attend to him?" "He doesn't do anything for the monks, Lord, which is why they don't attend to him." Monks: "You have no mother, you have no father who might tend to you. If you don't tend to one another, then who will tend to you? Whoever would tend to me should tend to the sick." If one's preceptor is present, the preceptor should tend to one as long as life lasts and should stay until one's recovery. If one's teacher is present, the teacher should tend to one as long as life lasts and should stay until one's recovery. If one's student is present, the student should tend to one as long as life lasts and should stay until one's recovery. If one's apprentice is present, the apprentice should tend to one as long as life lasts and should stay until one's recovery. If one who is a fellow student of one's preceptor is present, the fellow student of one's preceptor should tend to one as long as life lasts and should stay until one's recovery. If one who is a fellow apprentice of one's teacher is present, the fellow apprentice of one's teacher should tend to one as long as life lasts and should stay until one's recovery. If no preceptor, teacher, student, apprentice, fellow student of one's preceptor, or fellow apprentice of one's teacher is present, the Sangha should tend to one. If it does not, all the monks in that community incur an offense of wrongdoing. Now notice that all the other monks in this monastery were happy to let their fellow lie there, dying at his own pool of filth. Perhaps they thought they were very compassionate in doing that. Perhaps they thought they had goodwill. But the Blessed One came along and showed them that that was not the case. What did he do when he saw this monk lying in his own filth? Did he bend down and strangle him to death? No. Did he ask the other monks to carry him off into the woods and leave him to die? No. Did he tell everyone to vacate the monastery and go to other lodgings and leave the monk there to die? No. First he asked him what the problem was. He asked him what the sickness was. And then he asked him if he had an attendant. And when the answer was no, the Blessed One himself, along with Ananda, tended to him. They bathed him and picked him up with their own hands and placed him in bed. In this way, he set the example for how monks should treat other monks. This all stands in stark contrast to the behavior of the Suttavadins. In the last year of his life, Bhante Vimalaramsi was unable to care for himself. For a few days or weeks, the Suttavadins cared for him at Dhamma Sukha Meditation Center. Bhante Vimalaramsi expressly said that he wished to stay in his cabin. That was his wish, and that was in line with what the Vinaya says. But David Johnson, Liam McClintock, and the others that were responsible for his care couldn't handle it. and they shirked this responsibility and sent him off to be cared for by others, against his wishes. In doing that, their entire Sangha incurred an offensive wrongdoing. And I highly doubt that they have even to this day recognized that transgression as a transgression and committed to abstain from it in the future. Of course, this isn't the only instance in which this Sangha and its members are in violation of the Vinaya, but it's one that's relevant to this discussion on the nature of compassion and goodwill and taking responsibility for your actions. To reiterate and wrap this up, the invitation still stands to David Johnson and Delson Armstrong, and even to other Suttavadins. Will they keep driving, trying to outrun the sirens coming up behind? Or will they finally stop and answer a few reasonable questions?